Around 1200 BC, the most powerful civilizations on Earth collapsed within a single generation, and the only clue left behind was a name carved in stone: the Sea Peoples. From the Hittite Empire to the palaces of Mycenaean Greece, entire worlds were swallowed by darkness almost overnight. The Bronze Age had been an era of breathtaking interconnection where Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, and the Mycenaean Greeks traded, wrote letters, and signed treaties across thousands of miles. These were not primitive societies. They were sophisticated empires with bureaucracies, standing armies, and international diplomacy. The trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was one of the great cosmopolitan hubs of this world, a place where merchants from a dozen cultures haggled in a dozen languages. Its archives would eventually yield one of the most chilling documents in all of ancient history. That document was a letter, never sent, frozen in time when the city was destroyed, and it described enemy ships appearing on the horizon and setting fire to everything in sight. The letter ends mid-sentence, as if the writer was interrupted by the very catastrophe they were describing. Ugarit was not alone. At roughly the same time, Mycenae, Tiryns, Troy, Hatassah, and dozens of other cities were burned, abandoned, or destroyed. The palace economies that had sustained international trade for centuries simply ceased to exist. The one civilization that survived and left us a record was Egypt, and it was Pharaoh Ramesses III who gave these mysterious destroyers their name. In his great temple at Medinet Habu, he carved his victories over them in extraordinary detail. Ramesses described a confederation of peoples sweeping down from the north like a tidal wave, consuming everything in their path: the Hittites, the Syrians, the Canaanites, before turning their eyes toward Egypt itself. Inscriptions name groups called the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. But who were these people? Were they a single nation, a loose confederation, desperate refugees, or bloodthirsty conquerors? For nearly 2 centuries, scholars have argued furiously over their identity with no consensus reached. The leading theory for over a century linked the Sea Peoples to the Aegean world, and specifically the names Peliset and Denyen seem tantalizingly close to Philistines and Danaans, the Greek peoples of Homer's Iliad. If correct, the destroyers of the Bronze Age were somehow connected to the very heroes of Greek legend. DNA studies of Philistine burial sites at Ashkelon in Israel have recently provided a stunning piece of evidence, showing that early Philistines had genetic ancestry from the Aegean region, southern European genetics appearing suddenly in the Levant, around 1200 BC. This was not just cultural borrowing. These people actually moved. But the Aegean origin story only accounts for some of the Sea Peoples, and the question of why they were moving at all remains the deeper mystery. What could possibly set entire populations in motion simultaneously across the entire Mediterranean world? One powerful theory points to climate change. A prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean lasting decades, destroying harvests and triggering famine on a civilizational scale. Pollen records, isotope analysis from ancient soil, and even letters from desperate Bronze Age kings all point to the same terrifying picture. A letter from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit reads with heartbreaking urgency. It describes famine so severe that people were dying and begs for grain ships to be sent immediately as a matter of survival. That letter was answered, but the grain may have arrived too late. With food systems failing, the interconnected palace economies of the Bronze Age, which depended on stable long-distance trade in grain, copper, tin, and luxury goods, began to unravel. When one link in the chain broke, the whole system grew fragile. It was like a house of cards in a windstorm. Some scholars argue that internal rebellions and systemic inequality within Bronze Age societies created the conditions for collapse, with oppressed lower classes rising against palace elites. Others point to earthquakes, which geological evidence confirms struck multiple Aegean and Anatolian cities around this exact period. The most compelling recent thinking argues that no single cause brought down the Bronze Age. It was a perfect storm of simultaneous catastrophes feeding on each other in a cascade of collapse. Drought weakened agriculture, trade networks frayed, states lost revenue, armies went unpaid, and desperate peoples began to move. Into this already fracturing world came the Sea Peoples, and whether they were a cause of the collapse or a symptom of it remains the central debate. What we know for certain is that they arrived as the entire system was already under catastrophic strain. Ramesses III. tells us that the Sea Peoples moved not just as armies, but as entire peoples, men, women, children, and livestock traveling together in ox carts while their fleet sailed in parallel along the coast. This was not a raid, this was a migration at the point of a sword. The Hittite Empire, once a superpower that fought Egypt to a standstill at the famous Battle of Kadesh, simply vanished from history around this time. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned so thoroughly that archaeologists found entire storage magazines charred to ash, with no evidence of any subsequent occupation. Egypt fought back, and unlike its neighbors, it survived. In his 8th year, around 1177 BC, Ramesses III met the Sea Peoples in 2 decisive engagements, a great land battle at the border of Canaan and a naval battle in the Nile Delta itself. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict this naval battle in stunning detail. Egyptian archers lined along the shore raining arrows into the enemy ships, the Sea People's vessels capsizing and spilling feather-helmeted warriors into the water. Ramesses is shown colossal and composed above the carnage, drawing his great bow. Egypt won those battles, but winning battles did not mean winning the war against collapse. Over the following decades, Egypt's territory shrank, its wealth diminished, and its grip on Canaan slowly released. The mighty empire that had built the pyramids was entering its long twilight. Across the Mediterranean, in the ruins of destroyed civilizations, something new was being quietly assembled. The Sea Peoples who settled in Canaan, the Peliset, gave their name to a place we still call Palestine today. The Philistines, now confirmed as descendants of Aegean migrants, would eventually clash repeatedly with the Israelites, entering the Bible as the great enemies of David and Goliath. A people labeled as barbaric invaders in ancient propaganda were actually sophisticated settlers who built cities, made distinctive painted pottery, and ate pork. Other groups identified as Sea Peoples may have settled in places as far apart as Sardinia, Sicily, and the Levantine coast, seeding cultures that would shape the next millennium of Mediterranean history. The destroyers of the old world may have become the founders of new ones. The writing systems of the Bronze Age, Linear B in Greece, cuneiform across the Near East, largely vanished along with the palace economies that maintained them. When writing re-emerged centuries later, it came in an entirely new form, the Phoenician alphabet that would eventually become the letters you are reading right now. The Bronze Age collapse also ended the great international palace economies forever, and when civilization rebounded in Greece, in the Near East, and North Africa, it looked completely different. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal, and knowledge of how to work it spread rapidly across the now mixed populations of the Mediterranean. The transformation unlocked by the collapse was not merely technological, it was political and social. The old world had been built around centralized palace economies that controlled production and trade. The new world would eventually produce the city, state, democracy, and the concept of the individual citizen. The Sea Peoples remain archaeology's most tantalizing unsolved puzzle precisely because they sit at the hinge point of history, the moment that separates the world of Ramesses and Achilles from the world of Socrates and Caesar. Understanding them means understanding how everything we consider classical civilization came to be.
New excavations continue to rewrite what we thought we knew at Tel Dor in Israel, at Hala Sultan Teka in Cyprus, at Tiryns and Pylos in Greece. And each season brings fresh surprises that complicate the old narratives and hint at even richer stories beneath the surface. The ancient world keeps secrets stubbornly, yielding them only shard by careful shard.
What the story of the Sea Peoples ultimately teaches us is that even the most permanent-seeming civilizations are fragile systems balanced on assumptions of stability, climate, trade, and trust. And when enough of those assumptions fail simultaneously, even the mightiest empires can vanish in a generation. The Bronze Age collapse is not just ancient history, it is a warning written in stone. The Sea Peoples swept out of history as mysteriously as they swept into it, their true names and origins still debated, their legacy hidden in the DNA of living people, and the foundations of cities that exist today. They destroyed one world and helped build another, and that is perhaps the most ancient and most human story of all. If the collapse of the Bronze Age fascinates you, subscribe to History Retold for more deep dives into the moments that quietly